All right, looks like we're live. Welcome everybody to the What's on the Line podcast, episode 11. We're here to talk about striped bass. So the What's on the Line podcast started in a traditional podcast platform, just audio only, back in 2019, and we had quite a few episodes, about 8 or 9 right out of the gate, and then things get in the way, and so we haven't had an opportunity to bring more episodes to you since early 2020. And now with this new live streaming platform we've been using for raffles and other items with CCA Maryland, I wanted to bring this podcast back and use it as a monthly opportunity to bring you issues that we are working on your behalf if you're a member. And if you're not a member, we want you to find out more about CCA and still hear about what we're doing. And we welcome you to join us. So CCA is a nationwide organization, and we're the Maryland chapter. My name is David Sikorski, and I'm the executive director of CCA Maryland. And we are the nation's largest membership organization of tidal anglers and coastal enthusiasts that really care about our nation's natural resources that are available to us in our state waters, federal waters, and throughout our coastlines. CCA was founded in 1977 in Texas by a small group of anglers that were really just fed up with the mismanagement of redfish, speckled trout, and other species. And they realized that they needed to get involved and create a voice for anglers and for the resource. These fish, obviously, we utilize them. They're a shared public resource, but you have to have a voice for them too if we want to make sure there's plenty for the future. And so in Maryland, we were started in 1995, and so we were pleased to celebrate our 25th anniversary last year amongst the craziness that was 2020. I want to thank everybody that has supported CCA in the past and welcome you to support us in the future. As you see along the bottom, you can go to our state website, ccamd.org, and join CCA. Your membership here is welcome in all the other states as well. We're a nationwide membership, and we have some great states from here down to Florida and around to Texas and the full West Coast that are working very hard for your resources nationally and locally. So kudos. I'm glad to be part of CCA, and hope you join us. One little quick thing you may have seen on our Facebook and other information is a reef ball deployment that we just did for our habitat program in the Magothy River. So I'm proud to be wearing my McGuire Marine construction hat. Thank you to the team at McGuire and Magothy River Association and Sonar Kings, Nick Garrett. If you haven't seen it, we put some student-made reef balls in the Magothy River through a great grassroots partnership. These reef balls were made by students in elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools throughout Northern and Arundel County. And we just needed to find a great home for them in the Magothy there. So McGuire Marine donated their time yesterday, pushing that big barge into place and deploying these reef balls in a perfect little grid. And I know they're going to be a great place for fish. And I know there's going to be some oysters added to them in the future as well. So kudos to McGuire Marine, and thanks for the new hat. So without further ado, I want to get back into the topic of the night and welcome our two guests. So we have Mike Waine from the American Sport Fishing Association and Marty Gary, the Executive Secretary of the Potomac River Fisheries Commission. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hey, Dave. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Dave. We appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. So I was fortunate enough to just grow up an obsessed angler and outdoorsman. And after college, I started paying attention to fisheries management. And on the scene, I pop on the scene, and I think it was, in the maybe 2005 or 6 range, I started paying attention. And then in 2010, I got a call from somebody saying, hey, would you like to be on the Sport Fish Advisory Commission of Maryland DNR? I went, well, what the heck is this? And yeah, I have an opinion and I care, so I'm going to get involved. And I was fortunate enough to meet Marty at that time and his role at Maryland DNR. Marty was doing so much for the recreational anglers and fisheries management as a whole at Maryland DNR. So I was so pleased to meet you there. And the great work you did to orchestrate the Sport Fish Advisory Commission, an important advisory body to Maryland DNR. And it's great to have you down at the Potomac River on our southern border here in Maryland. So let us know a little bit about what the Potomac River Fisheries Commission is all about and your role there, and then we'll introduce Mike.
Thanks, Dave, for that opportunity. And I'll just say very quickly, it's good to have you in the fold at Sport Fish Advisory Committee and helping Maryland DNR and the stakeholders of Maryland with the fishery management processes. It's really, really important. I know you know that, and that's something you do from the goodness of your heart. You don't get paid for it, taking a lot of time to go to those meetings, but without that kind of input, it really doesn't work. So thank you. So the quick abridged version story for me is I spent 27 years at Maryland DNR, worked on a variety of different projects, including striped bass stock assessment project. Worked through as a legislative hearing officer. I kind of did a little bit of everything in the 27 years I was there. Worked up to the level of assistant director, and was very happy and loved Annapolis. But a once in a lifetime opportunity came along. A little agency known as the Potomac River Fisheries Commission. A lot of folks don't even know about it. It was formed back in 1963 over conflicts with the oyster resource. Everybody's familiar with the term the oyster wars. They had been going on in the 1940s and 50s. And in 1957, a young man named Berkeley Muse was shot and killed by a natural resource, a precursor of the natural resources police. They were called the oyster police back then. So out on the river poaching one night, the Oyster Navy made this arrest, and Berkeley was accidentally shot and killed. And the governors of the two states said enough is enough. So they formed this bi-state commission to co-manage the fishery resources of the tidal Potomac River. So our jurisdiction goes from the Woodrow Wilson Bridge down to the confluence of the river with the Chesapeake Bay. It's about 100 nautical miles. And along that stretch, it's got fairly diverse fish resources and shellfish as well, crabs and oysters. So there's a lot going on in that part of the river. Maryland technically still owns it, but our commission co-manages it. We have 4 appointed commissioners from the governor of Maryland and 4 from the governor of Virginia. They're my bosses. That's who I answer to, and I'm very privileged to be able to have that job. But that gave me an opportunity to kind of do my own thing. And it also gave me an opportunity to interact with the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, which, as I know, is a big part of our conversation tonight with Amendment 7 looming. And when I got to go there, I had participated in various committees and subcommittees in my role at DNR, but I got a real chance to sit at the management boards, which is very humbling and a great educational process, and got to meet some of the stellar young scientists, and I still consider him young, Mike Waine over here, who was one of the first people I came in contact with. And Mike had a lot of confidence in me, and had played a big role in getting me into chairmanship of the American Eel Board, and so I've had a great working relationship with Mike, and certainly he's gone on to good things at NOAA now with the American Sport Fishing Association. So that's my short story, and I'll yield over back to you and Mike.
Absolutely. No, that's a great segue into Mike's role. That's where I met Mike as well, at the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, and as a let's say less experienced advocate at the time. I can tell you, I looked at Mike across the room and I went, man, I don't like what this guy's saying. He's out to get us. He doesn't want what we want. But, Mike, we'll talk about that a little bit different, about the really important neutral role that ASMFC staff plays. And I'm proud to call Mike a partner in conservation now, with the great and vitally important role that he plays at the American Sport Fishing Association, the Fishing Tackle Industry Trade Association, which is just such an important voice and such a vital part of conservation. So, Mike, welcome. Tell us a little bit about what the work you do and ASA as a whole. And as Marty alluded to, you used to work at ASMFC.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And I really love what you're doing here. I think it's really important for us to talk about such a critical species and the management, where we're headed here. And Marty and Dave, I loved working at ASMFC. I think the management body is a good process. Public involvement, science, and management all comes together and accumulates into a pretty significant energy and force in fisheries management. And I think it's recognized and acknowledged for an important part of our fisheries management process in the US here. But yeah, after ASMFC, I moved on to NOAA Fisheries for a short time, and then decided to go a slightly different route and join the American Sport Fishing Association as their Atlantic Fisheries Policy Director. I wanted to get back into the management side of things, and that's why I made that change. And advocacy made a lot of sense for me because of my background with ASMFC and my knowledge of fishery science and management. So yeah, I'm the ASA's Atlantic Fisheries Policy Director. And for those of you that don't know, the American Sport Fishing Association is the nation's recreational fishing trade association and represents sport fishing manufacturers, retailers, wholesalers, and angler advocacy groups. And sport fishing is big business. There's 125 billion per year impact in the nation's economy, and that's has huge impacts for regional and state specific areas, especially in the Chesapeake Bay. And that really brings us to this rockfish fishery, which is so critically important, not only for the Bay region, but for a lot of the Atlantic coast from North Carolina all the way up through Maine. And so, Dave, I love what you guys are doing in Maryland, getting people involved, getting them educated, talking about all these tough topics that are controversial, because these are tough management decisions that we have to make, but that doesn't make them less important. And it's good that we have the opportunity to kind of run through what this should look like and talk about what people's ideas are for how to manage this fishery best. So thanks for having me on, and I'm excited that through ASA we're able to be a part of this, because this fishery is hugely important to a lot of constituents, especially ours.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm going to click over to a screen share here. We have the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission website, and give me 1 second. As you can see, scrolling along the bottom is that website, asmfc.org. There's a ton of information about a ton of very important species, and connected to every single one of those species is a partnership of states. The concept is that the states work together, just like Marty mentioned. The governors of Virginia and Maryland had to find a process to manage the waters that border both their states. The ASMFC is a very similar concept, and so if you're going to hear some acronyms tonight, some information on fisheries management, and I want to let everybody know, if you're following along, you're logged into your YouTube account or on your Facebook page, you can comment. In fact, somebody go ahead and comment. Let us know that the system is working, and we will be able to put
ourselves.
Yeah, we will put. I can see there we do have 34 people following along, a couple likes. So I did get a text message that we can be heard, so that's always good to know. But anybody wants to make a comment, it pops up on our screen, and also there is a delay. So what I just said, Facebook may not even be hearing just yet. So when a comment pops up, there you go. Mike Whistle. Mike Whistle is a very hardworking CCA volunteer. So Mike is our vice chairman of our board. He's commenting. It works. John Rodenhausen. Thank you, John. Hardworking guy at CBF, also a board member. Glad you're listening, folks. All right, so that's working. Okay, so to the screen, the ASMFC. There's a link here under management that I would recommend folks go look at. Management 101. It's lots of words, but it's important, and it's something you can read and start to absorb all this information we'll be sharing tonight. And we're going to recommend that you pay attention to moving forward. It's a big part of the work we do collectively, and so I want you all to be informed. So you can scroll down through and understand where the ASMFC came from and such, and look at the various layers. There are so many important people from different states and federal and state partners and academia and so on and so forth, citizens, the advisory panel piece here. I've been fortunate enough to be on the Striped Bass Advisory Panel and Menhaden Advisory Panel for quite a few years. And actually, next week, I am now at the table representing the legislative, or I'm a legislative proxy for Maryland. The seat that is held by Delegate Dana Stein. He has asked me to be his ongoing proxy. So moving forward, until something changes, I'll be at the table for you at the board level. But this will show you some of the different details of what's happening to blend science and management, to get important law enforcement important input from the stakeholders through the management, through the advisory panels. There's lots of different layers, lots of information here. I wanted to zoom in on this. State and federal cooperation and state-to-state cooperation. Folks get hung up about, is ASMFC federal? Well, no, it's not. It's these states agree to work together under a compact, and you can get into the law and all the details on this website here. But I wanted to show the map. I'm a visual guy. This blue sliver of water here is what the ASMFC is focused on. Those are the state waters, the state territorial waters. As Marty mentioned, he's got down here in the mouth, in the lower portion of the Potomac River. And so the idea is that if a species swims amongst these states' waters, the states work together to manage it. And then in this red section here, this is the exclusive economic zone. This is something founded by federal law, and this is the federal waters of the United States out to 200 miles. So we have state waters from generally the fall line, the tidal line, out to the 3 mile line in the ocean, and then the federal waters outside 200. And so we have a federal council process, which is similar to the commission process, but kind of founded by different laws and by different rules. And just next week at this winter meeting, there will be some joint boards, and that's for things like flounder, scup, and sea bass, species that have an inland component and an offshore component. And so the concept is cooperation, and that's the take-home message for everybody tonight. And you can find these maps and this information right here on the ASMFC website. Also, you can find the various species information under that management tab. So you can do a deep dive. There's not another excuse for having nothing to do as the pandemic continues. Get reading on the ASMFC website and become an informed angler. Also on here, I wanted to bring to everybody's attention, this is the meeting webinar link. It's right there on the calendar. The agenda is always available right here. There's live streaming information. You can listen along. There's public comment guidelines. Everything you need to do to be an engaged angler is right here, or engaged citizen that cares about this, because whether you fish or not, these are your resources. And so there's lots of background, lots of information, and you can scroll down through the week. I know that the Striped Bass Board meeting is on Wednesday. So here you go, Wednesday afternoon is when you want to mark on your calendars. And here is where the basic lineup of the agenda, and you click here and you get to some information. And there's always a supplemental tab as well. It's lots of information that these commissioners have to absorb and have to be ready to engage with and work on. It's a process that's managed by Robert's Rules. It's complicated in this virtual world, but I think these fisheries professionals have really got it down, and staff at ASMFC have done just a tremendous job of bringing everything together. And so what we're talking about tonight is, of course, a little bit about striped bass. So I want to bring up this document, which is available in that link I just left. This is the public information document. And so what Striped Bass has been working on, in fact, Marty, I'm going to have you mention some of the work you helped lead, because Marty is now the vice chair of the Striped Bass Management Board, and was played a pivotal role as a co-chair of a committee or a work group that came together to try and lead us to this point as things were unfolding with COVID. And the commission had just finished the Addendum 6 rules. So Addendum 6 is the most recent plan that all the states are following. And so out of Addendum 6, this work group is formed. Marty, take us from there. Let us know a little bit about that work.
Thanks, Dave. So back at the May meeting, as you were mentioning with ASMFC, they meet quarterly, and there's a whole bunch of other meetings from support groups that go on in between that. And so an example of one of those is this particular working group that has a specialized purpose to kind of frame out the important issues that would be considered for the public information document. So what they wanted to do first was have a small group of people representative of the coast for the range of the species, which is Maine to North Carolina. I threw my name into the hat. I think there was a lot of people that wanted to help out with that work group, but they wound up choosing only 6 people. But I threw my name in the hat for the heck of it. I didn't, I felt lucky to be selected. And the next thing I know, they were telling me I'm co-chair of it with Megan Ware of Maine. Get what you ask for, right?
Only the best, Marty. I told you.
I don't know about that, Mike. But Mike can attest to this. My co-chair was also a former colleague of Mike's at ASMFC, Megan Ware, and she is just a spectacular intellect. I really respect her. She's a star you all are going to be working with for a long time to come. So with Megan as a co-pilot, that kind of made things a little bit easy. But our purpose was pretty simple. It wasn't really to debate all the issues, but to frame them out properly, to make sure we cast a net over these issues. And as I'm sure you'll tell us, and Mike can comment too, we wound up identifying 9 discrete issues that were incorporated into this draft public information document. So we met several times over the summer. I believe we had 5 meetings, maybe 6 even. And it was a pretty rigorous schedule with everything else going on in COVID that everybody was dealing with. But the other part of this is, even though they were work group meetings, they were open. We had a lot of other commission members and the public involved in that. And folks, it's really hard to criticize the transparency, in my personal opinion. If you want to see what's going on and you don't see it, you only have yourself to blame, because every meeting you can have access to. And even the work group meetings, which we weren't really intended to have public dialogue, we made a point of reaching out to the public at specified points during those meetings. So and to finish it up, Dave, that work group went through several meetings over the summer. We identified these issues, we moved it on. And the next step in that process, and Mike and others can elaborate to this, is a plan development team, which took that information and fleshed out the document that we're all about to look at soon.
Yeah.
So I'll yield back.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead,
Dave,
Mike.
if I could just jump. Yeah, I mean, I'll just back up what Marty said. And you were on a lot of these calls too, Dave. There was a lot of opportunity for folks like myself and Dave and others to comment about the topics that the work group were talking about, to add some thoughts and ideas that would help the work group discuss the breadth of the issue and really think through some of these challenges. And what's nice is the amendment process is going to give us a really thorough approach to stakeholder engagement here. And so there'll be multiple, not only was there opportunity to provide input while the working group was trying to kind of frame the topic and the scope here, but there will also be multiple rounds of public comment on the specifics of the plan. And so, as Marty said, there's ample opportunity and there's a lot of great resources out there. And feel free to use folks like Dave and myself who do this full time to help guide you in making sure that you know what the opportunities are and know the process to sort of get involved and engage. So I just wanted to take a moment there because I know people are joining in and we're about to embark on a really significant management action.
Yeah.
And we want everybody to be involved here because that's how we'll all grow together on this and have the best fisheries management approaches, as if everybody weighs in and decides, kind of provides their input on what that should look like.
Absolutely. And so, I mentioned my little bit of history of getting into fisheries management when I met Marty and met you, Mike. And, I was fishing a lot in those days. And I remember where I started to really feel comfortable about fisheries management was where I saw my on-water experience reflected in some of the documents and some of the management plans. That said, there were things that I didn't agree with. And just bringing that on-water perspective really falls under the management side of things, more so than the science, right? The science is collected in a specific way, done by professionals. There's stuff done that's in partnership with fisheries, with people actively fishing. There's things that are done independent of that. And that's some important piece of the science stuff that we're not going to get very deep into. We did talk about striped bass management on previous podcasts, so I recommend folks check that out. And one of the things that I was fortunate enough to take part in is something called the Marine Resource Education Program. And it's a really important resource for folks that want to get engaged in fisheries management and these processes and step up to the plate and step up to the microphone sometimes. So the Marine Resource Education Program is something that I'm proud to be on the steering committee of and helped moderate a program for the last 5 or so years before COVID to help inform and educate people. And this goes back to the transparency Marty's talking about and Mike, the opportunities to step up to the plate and be involved in this process. They are there like nowhere else in our country, really, or in the world. And that makes them difficult because you're having to manage all different people and lots of unknowns. I think everybody understands that you can't see fish. It's somebody, I think somebody said one day, it's like counting trees, but you can't see them and they move, as a good way to describe assessing a stock of fish. I highly recommend people to dig into some of those details of the stock assessments. We won't get too deep in that today, but let's get talking through this document. Again, Addendum 6 led us up to where we are today. That's where states are fishing under those plans right now. And Maryland's, while we're still debating what 2021's fishery is going to look like, and CCA has provided plenty of input and some criticism of how Maryland's Addendum 6 rules have played out. It's time to focus to the future because that's really what matters with these striped bass. And so this is a document you can find on the website. Like I said, you can see I'm on page 74 of 118. And so again, to speak to the transparency of this process, prior to this is a verbatim transcript of everything said at the last meeting. So if you want to see what people say, rather than take it from somebody that might misconstrue it, see what they said. It's written down. Do some reading. You have to point the right direction here. Also, the agenda is there, and so I want to just walk through this document. It's perfect. I mean, it's a great document, and read these notes. Initial draft document for board review, not for public comment. If you find a later version of this and it says for public comment, you'll know that you're in the right document. That's key. And the staff at ASMFC does a great job of updating things, and they're very available. And so look for this information and realize that this is a draft, and the board is in charge. Within the rules of the law and everything else, the board is working together to present something, from that work group that Marty co-chaired on forward to the public for multiple levels of input. So it says it right there. Your comments are invited. Why is ASMFC proposing this action? What's the process for developing an amendment? Here's the timeline. I think this timeline might be a little bit off because of COVID, but we'll find out next week as we talk about the next steps. And so folks have this document, but realize this is a kind of a living, breathing thing, and it will go through this process over the next period. I don't know if either of you could speak to the accuracy of that timeline here. I have to get caught up. So
looks good to me, Dave. Like I said, this shows that there'll be multiple opportunities for comment, and so the first time is through this public information document where they're trying to get general ideas that help them flesh out the specifics. And then once those specifics are fleshed out through everybody's input, then there's another round of comment, which you can see later in this year into early 2022.
Yep.
So there's multiple rounds here. We're at the fairly beginning stage, and Marty and the subgroup have put us in a really good place because they've already done a lot of discussions on to form this short list that Dave is showing on the screen right here. Yeah,
and here's the work that Marty mentioned earlier, and will guide this process. And this could change. Some folks may. I know there was conversation previously about, is this too much of a heavy lift? Can staff manage it? Can the cooperating states support in the way they need to? And so that's a constant living, breathing thing. And it's all in partnership. So why don't we start at the top here and talk about some of the fishery goals and objectives. I think everybody that has paid any attention to striped bass knows that they are overfished and overfishing is occurring. Let's define those later when we're talking about reference points and have a actual visual for what that means. But basically, the population's not at the right status, and it wasn't moving in the right direction until managers took action in Addendum 6. That's kind of the short-term fix. This is now the rebuilding of the plan. Is that probably a fair way to explain it?
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair, Dave. This is a pretty overarching, the goals and objectives. I'll just give you a little bit of insight on some of what we discussed. In addition to the way you just framed it, the work group, brainstormed several goals and objectives which might be missing from the existing list in Amendment 6. So, of course, we're working under Amendment 6. We're looking to embark on Amendment 7. And I'll just mention a couple of these, reflecting on the stock complexity and the assessment science, consistent management and monitoring, recognizing potential impacts of climate change. Okay, so a lot has changed since 2003 when the last amendment was adopted. And as you all know, and we've heard a lot, and thankfully, that climate change is going now looks like it's going to really be addressed. And so that was part of our discussions. Improving catch accounting for the recreational sector, promoting responsible fishing practices and stewardship. Those are just a smattering of a few things that you didn't see previously that might be considered. But again, this is and Mike, correct me if I'm using the wrong terminology, but it's the preliminary information gathering process. Am I right about that?
Yeah, and I think this section often gets overlooked, I feel, the goals and objectives, just because it can be kind of hard to think big picture, like what do I really want this fishery to look like? But that's really what's being asked here. And so you got to kind of think about what do I really want out of this striped bass fishery? And when you think about that, it's got to be achievable. So it's got to be thoughtful, but I think there's good opportunity here to look over the objectives and the goals that are currently here and really think about, do these capture what I want to see out of the fishery? That's the question you really have to ask yourself. And is there anything missing? And that's how the work group set this up. And so they're looking for that feedback here. Like, for example, from ASA standpoint, we'd like to maximize access to the resource, but we understand that we are in an overfished and overfishing condition, and so the stock is in trouble. So we want to make sure that we're taking action to correct that, but at the same time balancing that with opportunities to access the resource. So that's kind of how I think about this in this section, just to give you an example of what the commission and the management group is looking for. Does that kind of match what you were thinking, Marty?
Absolutely. And Mike, I'm so glad to hear you say that fundamental question of what do you want your fishery to look like? And I got to say, Dave and Mike, going forward, every one of us that have a role with this, whether we're representing an organization or you're a member of the delegation like you are, Dave, for Maryland now, as as Delegate Stein's proxy. I mean, we need to be conveying that message. You hit it right on the head, Mike. It's what do you want this fishery to look at? This is I'm excited and kind of feel the burden too of this process that's looming before us, because we want to get it right? Because you only get so many cracks at a process like this. Having Amendment 6 having been adopted in 2003, and here we are coming up on 18 years later, and so I hope everybody will take this chance to ask that, to try to answer that question that Mike just framed up. What do you want this striped bass fishery to look like going forward? So that just needs to be a pervasive theme in all of our discussions.
Absolutely. And what's so important about the conversation that the board is continuously having, in managing this fishery, is the board is giving direction to technical folks, the technical committee, and there's important dialogue there where the board gives the technical committee direction. The technical committee isn't trying to steer it one way or another, and the questions that the board wants answered are always, what the technical or a big part of the technical committee is providing. And a big part of that is the stock assessment, assessing the status of the stock, the population, and the trends. Stock assessments are all about trends, and everything in fisheries management is a long-term process, simply because it's just it's nature that we're talking about. And there's only so much that we can do to control things. From an angling perspective, and with striped bass, we control fishing mortality. And so we're controlling the activities and trying to balance days on the water, the length of the fish, and how many fish you can keep throughout the various jurisdictions that share this resource. And all that adds up to our impact on the biology or the biomass of fish. And so this biological reference points issue is kind of almost like setting the guardrails for that lead us to what we want our fishery to look like. And I think there's a chart here that'll help show this a little bit more, but I'd recommend for folks to read this and get to understand it a little bit. I'm going to go down to the biomass kind of status chart here, because with striped bass, we track the spawning stock biomass, the females. And that's pretty common in fisheries management to kind of understand the potential for future spawning and future recruitment. This concept that, that's what we're looking at, and making sure that we're investing in the potential for future fish to enter into the system. And so managers back in 1995 decided to draw this line up here, the target. And that target was based on 125% of the estimated biomass back then?
From 95, yeah. From
95. So we had a recovered fishery. Manager said, okay, well, this is about where we think it's going to be. It was a subjective approach to drawing a line, but got us to where we are today until some things started changing. And so the threshold here is what we don't want the biomass to go below, this kind of purplish bluish blob. We want that to stay in between the dark red line and the dotted line. Ideally, a target is just what you would think. You want to hit the target. And so a big part of the conversation around biological reference points has been, again, yes, what do we want our fishery to look like? And what do we want to set our target at? We last set it in 1995. So I'll stop there and hear you guys' thoughts on that. How about Marty, you go first on these biological reference points and your perspective and with your experience.
Yeah, I think, and I don't want to add further complexity to this, but this will be one of the more fascinating discussions. If you look at the history of how we've managed this fishery, and you both are aware, and a lot of folks listening in are aware, that up until, I guess it was 2015, We were looking at the bay was managing under the harvest control model, separate from the coast. And of course, we went under a coast-wide management, I think effective 2015. I believe that's when it was. And there's been these sub discussions about, should we look at going back to the two stock model, I guess. I'm not sure that's the right terminology, but, looking at managing the bay, because I think the fishery managers in the bay, and I was privileged to be a part of that process, felt like, we did a pretty good job with that. There's still an interest there. It's still being explored. There's some data deficiencies that have prevented really having an opportunity to look at bringing that to fruition. But for me, the targets and thresholds too are, relative to what we want this fishery to look like. Are they achievable? And Mike, I heard you say earlier, you want to make this, your goals, objectives, everything you want in this plan, you want to be achievable. And we want to work together as best we can to formulate everything we want to see in this fishery going forward. And I know I found myself looking back at the spectacular recruitment events that we had back in the 1990s, right? Yeah. So earlier this afternoon, I reached out to one of my good friends, and I think a lot of us know Eric Slokovitz back at DNR, and I said, Eric, I've been pondering this whole recruitment, and look at the top 10 or 12 recruitment years. More than half of them occurred between, I think, 1993 and 2005.
Yeah, let me explain that real quick. I brought the screen back up. I didn't want to distract people because I was moving all over the place. But what I didn't mention previously is this recruitment piece here, and I think these are age 1 fish. Yeah, so when you see this bar, it's the millions of age 1 fish. It's the estimate here on this right y-axis, and so you'll see that bar there, and that's an important part of a survey that is done in Maryland and Virginia to estimate how many little fish are there. And so recruitment is when they've recruited. If you ever see a young of year analysis, that's when there's 0. And so you can see these in a couple different ways and in a couple different ways that they average them. But the bottom line is what Marty's talking about right here is look at what this level of biomass produced in these years. And so go ahead, Marty.
Well, I think and it's really kind of a rhetorical question, right? So you had this incredible period of reproduction where we were blessed in 96, 93, 2001. I think that's the actual rank order of those. Those are the top 3-year classes. And then we had some other good ones in that time frame. But if you look outside of that range and even more recent years, we're not seeing that. And I know I find myself, it's my own personal kind of thoughts that run through my mind. Can we achieve certain standards based, on the way the stock is performing now, the way it's reproducing now? The last 5 years have been concerning, right? We had a good year class in 15. We had a really good year class in 11, but that's sort of what's driving the fishery right now, I think. So I don't mean to pin this down and get too spread out with it, but this is a fairly complex discussion. But it kind of, to me, it sets the bars on where you're going to go with this fishery, right? So You want it to be achievable, and we have to set those bars in an achievable way, those thresholds and those targets. And Mike, I know you have a really strong technical background. Maybe you can frame it a little tighter for us. I'm kind of laying it out in a more general manner.
No, I mean, I think it's important to try and stay as high level as we can here. If we get too far into the weeds, it can get really complicated. But the patterns that you guys pointed out here are what we're seeing in the SSB figure, which is the blue blob or the purplish blue blob that Dave talked about. And that period of strong recruitment from, we'll say, about basically throughout the 1990s and into the early 2000s are what, really built back those spawning female population. And then that period after the mid 2000s where we see that lower recruitment, Dave, thanks for pointing that out, is where we see this decline in the adult spawners. So you can't have a lot of adults if you don't have a lot of babies. That's pretty obvious.
Yep.
The struggle here, the terminology we use is there's no stock recruitment relationship for striped bass. So what that means, that's pretty technical, but what that means is that just because you have a lot of adults doesn't mean you're going to get a lot of babies. And that's frustrating because there's a lot of other things at play that we don't necessarily have control over that are impacting recruitment, water quality, habitat degradation, and fragmentation. So those are things that obviously have big spawning impacts, but we don't really have control over that. But the thing we do have control over is fishing mortality. And so that's what the management body uses. And that's where we get into these questions about, like, should we be protecting more females? And what can that do for our stock when they're on the spawning grounds, for example, or headed to the spawning grounds? And that's all important part of the discussion. And so this is important. These figures are really important because they describe the scenarios of what's going on. But unfortunately, that stock recruitment relationship isn't there. And there's a lot of other factors at play. But that doesn't mean that we can't do things to help this stock. And that's really what this document is all about.
Right. And what I hear people talk about all the time is, even without that stock recruitment relationship, you mentioned the logical connection there. Lots of parents equal lots of babies. It's just the survivability of those babies and the success in spawning that's unpredictable. And whatever those environmental conditions were, coupled with this biomass level, led us to these peaks. And this is a period of time I mentioned earlier. I was on the water a lot, so it's easy to see almost year class to year class to year class the fish you're catching and are more prevalent. And in the Chesapeake and other producer areas that have juvenile fish, it's very easy for an angler to go out there and look out and just think there's fish forever. It happens all the time, and that's what we're out there trying to catch them. So of course we're finding them. But I know that the hot spots in the Chesapeake for catching these juvenile fish as they grow into spawning stock, because we largely harvest the fish that are before their spawn, and a lot of male fish in the Chesapeake. So the places that they've been available to anglers seems to be shrinking in my experience and in the experience of many anglers in the Chesapeake. And so that's concerning as well. But it's reflected right here in the data. I mean, it makes sense that these fish that are born in this year and they're one now, they're not going to be in the SSB until they're 7, 8, 9 years old. All this stuff is in tables and documents in the stock assessment that to me is just fantastic. You can see it. You can almost watch the progression of these strong year classes go through these population estimate tables that produce these charts and graphs. So I recommend for the science-minded folks that can pick through those numbers, dig in and see what this stock assessment is telling us. And it's not just numbers out of the sky. It's important stuff. And but back to biological reference points, ultimately you're trying to set these boundaries to achieve a certain outcome. And so specifically, there's kind of not two camps, but some folks are saying, well, if we haven't reached this target, we should lower it. There's other folks that have been saying for a long time now they want to have a little more liberal harvest and lower the bar. And some folks say that's like changing the rules of the game changing the rules in the middle of the game. And again, you can have as many perspectives as you can imagine amongst the millions of anglers that pursue this stock, these fish, and of course, plenty of opinions around the ASMFC table. So I see Lenny Rudo, Fish Talk Magazine, asked us a question. I'll bring that in. The first question, do we know why we had such a good 2016 recruitment but didn't see a corresponding bump in SSB after that? And I will say, just to remind everybody, like Marty mentioned, 2015 is the year class that we're looking at in 2016 right here. And I think I have an answer to that, but I'll let either Marty or Mike go ahead and chime in.
I'm going to tag team this with Mike, and I'll tee it up first, Mike. And I think
go for it. Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Well, so Lenny, I think that thanks for asking that question. And I don't have all the young of the year data right in front of me, but I'm pretty sure you're referring to 2015. That was the last big year class we had. I think 2016 was actually a really bad one. Mm-hmm. It followed afterwards. It wasn't very good. But is it maybe it's on the chart there, Dave?
Yeah, it's the last one, and I should have had another chart ready, but
or maybe it's average. 15 was really good though, and it dropped off. But either way, and Mike, this is where I'm not real participatory in the technical committees, but you were the striped bass liaison for staff, right? So you work with the technical committees and everything. But I'm pretty sure the SSB, those fish don't show up in there until what, their age? Is it 8 or beyond, something like that? Or maybe it's an incremental.
It's incremental, yeah. So this is what I was going to say is at age 5, it's like 50% of females are mature, and then it increases from there. So age 6 is a little higher, and I believe at age 9 they're fully mature. So that's playing a role in this as well. Your 2015 year class in 2020 is only 5 years old, and so those fish are ultimately 50% mature, and so only half of them are contributing to that SSB figure that you see there. Does that make sense to you guys?
Eric Zlokovitz, who we gave a shout out to earlier, he said technically 2016 was above average, but not dominant. And so the young of the year, if we were looking at a different chart, it would show that it's an index and it compares year to year to year. And there's a rolling average. And so, like Eric mentioned, 2016 was technically above average. Just so folks know, 2020 was terrible. Imagine that.
Yeah, and the other thing I would just add, Dave, is these are estimates, of course. So there is uncertainty associated with them. That young year survey index that Dave and Marty talked about is a really good indicator of spawning success and has been in the history of this stock. Mm-hmm. But there is uncertainty, and so it's not always, and this is where it can get confusing, but I think it's important to note that it's not always a perfect relationship here where you're like, okay, I see a strong year class. How come SSB isn't perfectly responding to that? And that can create some confusion, but generally sort of you can see the trends playing out in the data here. And what ends up sort of leveling off SSB in the next several years is actually those strong year classes in 2011 and 2015. So we can't see that. You actually see that in the projections, which this figure does not show. But that decline in SSB is from that period of poor recruitment after the mid-2000s, and then the leveling off of SSB and the incline that we're going to anticipate seeing as long as we keep our fishing mortality where we need to is going to be driven by those stronger year classes in more recent years.
Right. And there's tons of information that can help you understand the different blocks of time in that stock assessment and such. And, we really don't have time for tonight. I wish I had some better prepared slides. I apologize for that, but there's a lot going on right now. So Mike Brubacher is asking a question. Is there any discussion of a moving SSB target based on yearly recruitment in some way? So I'd almost describe that like as an if-then type situation. Like if this happens, then management responds accordingly from a target perspective. I would say the answer is no, but I don't know. Am I wrong?
So I guess I'll jump in. Currently, that's not being considered. It's something that could be offered as a suggestion. But typically, because ASMFC bases all of its management actions on these reference points, they like to bring some stability to those reference points so that we can work towards a goal over a longer period of time. And so that's typically why you don't see biological reference points changing over shorter time frames.
Yeah, and I want to also, I think a big part of that as well is we don't have the precision and the capacity to manage what it would take to do that. And a lot of this stuff is again,
confidence in the data.
Yeah, confidence in the data. You start cutting things down into smaller resolutions and things you lose confidence. I mean, that's a big part of the challenge with recreational angler data. And I don't want to jump into that yet, but I have another question. 2021 is going to be worse because all the extra fishermen getting on the water from COVID. So I'm going to answer this one. I would say it's not a matter of worse, but we really don't know, and there are going to be some slight data gaps. The commission and the folks that's going to be part of the conversation next week. So I'd recommend you log in at that and check that out. The reality is it's going to take a little while to really understand the impacts of what happened because of COVID. There was definitely an increase, but I know some data I saw recently from Maryland DNR where licenses never went above the long-term averages. It's just they took a while to sell, and then all of a sudden they sold when people were able to get outside. And then also the survey system, which surveys anglers on the water, folks with a clipboard coming up to you at the dock. A lot of times they were not able to get out into the field. That's a program that's a state partnership with the commission and their federal partners to get out there and make sure that folks can interview you. So when you get interviewed, give them the accurate information. There's another piece of rec angler survey information. It's called the effort survey. And that's a mail-based system. So when you get something in the mail, fill it out accurately, because that's what will drive management. And that's what we're talking about tonight, the management stuff, what's on the paper, which should absolutely reflect what's happening on the water, but it's going to take a little while until we really understand the impact. I can tell you, I reported in a newsletter today to give you an idea of the commercial impact in the Chesapeake, or the Maryland portion of the Chesapeake. Maryland's commercial fishermen have had about 1.44 million pounds available for their catch this year. And we were told just last week that the DNR believes it's about 35% below that was their actual take. And so that's a much more quickly quantifiable information than what happens with the about 125,000 rec anglers that get on the water, with their license in Maryland each year. So it's really hard to say. And let me see some other questions here. So John Rodenhausen's talking about, was the 99 to 2002 drought causal or coincidental in the increase in fish? Marty, I will throw this one to you because I've wanted to mention this a couple times already tonight. Every single spring, I look for your Facebook posts of your prediction of fish coming onto the spawning grounds, what the year classes look like, and then what anglers can expect. So Marty does this tremendous this forecast. Also, I've seen you be right on top of what's happening on your river, the Potomac, that relates to John's question, the flows in the spring. So talk a little bit about the conditions we're looking for, and biologists believe bring us good spawns, and what you look for each spring.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And that's a great question, John. And I'll kind of answer it indirectly. I know I remember the drought you're referring to because there were some moisture impacts that year as well. But in general, I think it's pretty common knowledge that wet, cool springs have seen some of our biggest and best recruitment events. 93, 96, 2001 are, of course, perfect examples of that. But they don't always match up that way. We've had a couple where we thought, oh, this is going to be a layup. We're going to have I put up a little post saying I'm really optimistic this spring, or mentioned something that Dave said, he's read and picked up one that. And I've been talking to the biologists like Eric and all his colleagues, Beth Versack, and a lot of folks know a lot of the biologists in the Chesapeake. They were out on these spawning stock surveys. I participated in that project for 5 years myself. So I was out on those surveys, and we watched it really closely and watched this interface between the environmental conditions that are occurring in the spring, but they don't always pan out that way. I guess the latest and greatest science kind of tells us that under ideal situations where the temperature's right and you don't have these oscillations in temperature up and down, but it stays cool and it's wet, you get the runoff that drives nutrients into the water that feeds phytoplankton, which is going to be the food for zooplankton, which is going to be your food for your newly hatched striped bass. And so when those cool, wet years, you have that infusion of nutrients, and that's kind of a theory that's been floating around for a long time, and it's even been talked in the academic circles. But the other fascinating thing that's emerging most recently is, we had a couple years where we had that cool, wet spring, but we didn't see the recruitment that we were hoping for. Is the timing of those plankton blooms, and what happens in climate change if they're just a little off, right? Those blooms with the timing of the fish's arrival and the spawning, and it's all conjecture at this point. But The general thought is those cool, wet springs afford us our best opportunity for good recruitment, and we're kind of at the mercy of Mother Nature, but they don't always work out that way. And as much as Dave might compliment me, I've been really wrong sometimes. So I hope that answers a little bit of his question.
Yeah, but what good angler hasn't sworn that they were just going to tear him up? You know, weather coming in, pressure dropping. We're going to catch him today and just come home with a skunk. So, you know, we all swing and miss, and that's a big part of stepping up to the plate. So I've always appreciated that information, and I'm looking forward to the 2021 version, Marty. So, you know, again, that's a great explanation, and we're going to jump through some of these issues real quick. So I want to make sure we touch on most of them. We're getting close to an hour, and we try and keep these to about an hour, but hey, it's COVID. So we're all sitting at home looking for entertainment. I'll stay on as long as
striped bass.
Yeah. And it's striped bass. So we'll stay on as long as you two are allowed and batteries and everything allow. So I've got my screen. Let's bring it back. So Mike Brubacher kind of mentioned something that is similar to a management trigger. And so I'm gonna really point out for folks to look at issue 3, management triggers, and also the stock rebuilding kind of targets and schedules and stuff, because you'll see here there's these kind of like if-then statements in some cases, and these are key because this is kind of baked into the plan of saying, all right, if these conditions occur down the road, then certain action must be taken or should be taken, and you know the specific words are important here. I remember. In previous action, I think in Amendment 6, there was a thing where if certain, I think 3-year classes fell below average, then the board would have to take certain action in order to react to that. So where Mike was asking about the SSB target moving, no, the target doesn't move like we answered, but the management plan can have reactionary type things in it where it says if this condition exists and we're being precautionary, we better take action quickly. And the commission, you'll look at Management 101, the website, and you'll see that there's a quick way to get things done, and that's an addendum, and there's an amendment, which is a longer, more holistic kind of approach. So I want folks to check this stuff out, and we'll be talking about this plenty, and the board will talk about a lot of this plenty. And maybe when we get the PID released, John Bello had asked, when do we expect the PID out? Well, we hopefully we'll see it approved next week for public comment, and then as soon as staff can finalize everything, it'll be out quickly, and there'll be a series of opportunity for weighing in. And that's just the first bite at the apple. So where was I going here? Let's see. All right. How about we talk a little bit about regional management? You know, we have a brand new way to kind of look at striped bass. Me personally, being a Marylander, I think it makes a lot of sense to have consistency across Maryland, Potomac River, and Virginia, a place I can fish with one license. You know, these 3 jurisdictions, thanks to reciprocity. So, Marty, what do you think about consistency in these jurisdictions? I know we've had it for quite some time, at least on the size fish that we harvest recreationally. Now we don't. Maryland, Virginia, and Potomac River have different size and bag limits in some cases.
Yeah, thanks, Dave, for highlighting that. This came up in the work group this summer to the point where we were discussing some of the major topics, and we decided to have a full-blown discussion about trying to achieve 3 things, and Mike already touched on one of those. He mentioned stability. So management stability, flexibility, and regulatory consistency, and that's what you just mentioned, Dave. You know, for the first time in my career, my almost 36-year career, I'm coming up on 36 year of my career. This is the first time, you know, when we implemented the Addendum 6 changes in 2020 for this past year. This is the first time I can remember you could be in any of the Bay jurisdictions and every single one had a different set of regulations. So you could be, for instance, up in the District of Columbia, and let's not lose sight of the fact that the district is a member of ASMFC, right?
Yep.
They have a vote, and they have striped bass regulations for their jurisdiction. So you take your boat and you're in the district, and you go from there below the Woodrow Wilson, and you're into PRFC jurisdiction. Go down the river, turn left into Maryland, and then go swing, take a right, and go a little ways, and you're in Virginia, right? You would experience different regulations for striped bass in every single one of those jurisdictions. And that's the first time in my career. And we all talked at the work group about this issue, making sure that we pointed out to the broader management board going forward, that this is, something that we'd like to achieve: stability and regulatory consistency. The stability part is not getting this herky jerky from one year to another, right? And that was a big shift in 1 year because of the management trigger, right? We had to reduce. And Mike, I guess it's hardwired into the plan. If you hit, I think it had to have a couple different triggers. We had to reduce the fishing mortality rate in 1 year. That was very specific language. So stability, so we don't have this jerking around, knee jerk back and forth, but also having flexibility. I don't know if we're going to get the conservation equivalency, but that's going to be a big discussion. And it's a very, coastwide, it's a big issue, big topic.
Yeah.
And then this regulatory consistency. So if anybody's really bored or has time on their hands, go back into the ASMSC website and look at some of those proceedings from the work group meetings this past summer. And my co-chair, Megan, did a nice job. And when we presented this to the board, she created a Venn diagram, right? So in a Venn diagram, you've got these different spheres and there's overlap. But when you look at these three concepts of stability, flexibility, and regulatory consistency, it's a minimal overlap, and it's a delicate dance to try to get them all. Everybody was in agreement. We would like to see essences of all three of those themes, right? But it's tricky. So I don't know if everybody's picking up on what I'm saying. And Mike, if I'm messing something up, maybe you can dial it in a little higher resolution. But yeah, I think innately what I'm referring to. I hope.
I know what you're talking about, Marty, and I think it's coming across clear. I'm going to ask Mike a question, and he can weigh in too. Mike, of course, representing our important industry, all the retailers and tackle manufacturers and everything you mentioned earlier at ASA. What do you think about regional management? Because you've got all of us really that are represented by ASA, and so many important businesses that every angler must stop at to go fishing, and not to mention that every single one of those businesses and dealers and such pay into an important excise tax program that was created by anglers, really the original conservationists, to help fund some of these surveys and programs. So give us like a bigger kind of coast-wide approach. What do you think about regional management and how it relates to some of the stuff Marty was talking about?
Yeah, Dave, thanks for the question. And this is something that we think about a lot, because you're right, it has huge impacts to our membership and across a broad geographic range here, not just in the Chesapeake Bay. And that's why, you heard me talk about this a little bit earlier. We think access is really important. We'd like people to go fishing. We think that that's a really important activity, especially during these times. And keeping people fishing is really what we'd like to work towards. But we understand that the stock is in need of conservation. And so that's the balancing act that we're thinking through, is how do we maximize access while also making sure that we achieve the conservation goals? And my thoughts on this is perhaps that comes with less management flexibility to each individual state. And I'll expand upon that a little. When the stock is super healthy and we're not as concerned about the resource and the spawning and the recruitment and all that, then maybe that's the opportunity to allow the states to really dig in and kind of decide what management measures work best for their specific anglers in specific areas and specific modes. But when the stock is in a poor condition and we need to have more certainty in achieving the conservation goals, maybe allowing that flexibility that adds uncertainty to whether we're going to achieve what we need to achieve shouldn't be allowed. So that's kind of where we're thinking on this. I think there's a lot to be discussed through this management document about what specifically that means. But ultimately, what we know about the data program, just briefly, the catch data program, is that when we pool it over broader geographic areas and over longer timeframes, there's more certainty in that information, as opposed to chopping up the catch information on specific modes, so private versus charter, and specific areas, so individual states, I'll say. And I just feel like if we could find a management approach that brought more certainty, and if that meant we had to have more consistent regulatory consistency across a broader geographic range when the stock is in a poor condition, perhaps we would be better served meeting our conservation goals by doing that. So that's kind of the way we're thinking about this. I mean, I know that there's more to it than just that, because that kind of doesn't really answer the questions of, well, what about, these charter boats that really rely on this month, or what about, that specificity is why there's a public input process here and why we want to hear from everybody. But I just want to also mention that we're all going to have to roll up our sleeves and be willing to come to the table with thoughtful ideas and perhaps give something for the resource. And so that's kind of how we're thinking about this.
Absolutely. No, it's spot on. I brought up Greg Schutt's comment, maximize access while meeting conservation goals. It's a fine line. It's dancing on the lips of a tiger sometimes. And in this is arena that so many people are so knowledgeable about and so passionate about and have such a different regional perspective or participate in a different way. I think the most recent number was something like 9 million anglers participate in the fishery, something like that. Think of all that, all those perspectives coming together. So you really have to be careful and cautious. And frankly, those who are going to engage in this process as well need to be respectful of each other. There's no one state that is the good guy, the bad guy, or anything like that. I think personally, I think we really need to be careful about having our cake and eating it too. We can't do that. It's no different than a sound financial investment. And I hate to even bring that up given what's going on the stock market, but that's the idea here. The managers have to be careful, especially when the stock is overfished and overfishing is occurring. So I know there's a whole bunch of other different ideas, but I think this idea of what you're all talking about, and Marty, I'm so happy you brought up those 3 key goals that the group talked about: stability, flexibility, and regulatory consistency. Because Mike, I know that when tackle shops in Maryland right now are facing a potential closure in August or July. And we're talking about splitting a hair of a hair of a hair of a hair when it comes to the data to try and play out this, do we close in August? Do we close in July? You and I worked together with a lot of other great partners on a industry letter that we all signed and said, hey, Maryland DNR, don't make your conservation equivalency plan complicated. Have your commercial folks give the cuts, have the recreational fishery give the cuts. Don't chop us all up. You don't have the resolution of data, but
exactly.
You have the political need. So where do we land? We landed with commercial not making any cuts. And it's led to complexity that we're still dealing with today that frankly I think is unnecessary and somewhat of a waste. That said, for me personally, I'm always torn because I believe in that flexibility because I have faith in the process and faith in everybody around the table to come up with what's right. And there's never all the criticism I make of Maryland DNR. It's not personal. The folks that are working there hard are great folks, and just like all these other states, and they have different users that they have to deal with, and it's not very simple. But I look forward to seeing some of the concepts that come out of this document, and we couldn't finish this even though we're at an hour and 8 minutes without talking about recreational angler accountability. This is something that's on the list. And frankly, I think it's the wrong way to describe the topic. Accountability means different things. But to me, if a rec angler is accountable, they buy their license, they follow the regulations, they're responsible to the resource and their fellow anglers. That's accountability. But in the fisheries management lens, we're talking about very complicated systems that are trying to understand the activities of those millions of anglers around our country. Data sets that computers couldn't even crunch if we were talking about counting every fish that an angler caught and reported. So there's often recreational angler accountability is often used as a weapon against the recreational fishery, especially by commercial, especially when CCA is involved, because there's always back and forth between us and the commercial fisheries. But let's talk about recreational accountability and how it actually, it's practical improvements that we can make from the angling community and that managers can lean on to say, you know what, we're making sure that there's access and opportunity to get out and enjoy these fish, but we're also going to craft our regulations in a way that maximize survivability of fish that cannot be brought home for size reasons. Maybe they're too small, maybe they don't fit the slot. And we want to maximize if these fish are going to survive. So I'll start off just by saying that the management plan assumes a 9% mortality of the fish that are released. And if you go back into the stock assessment and a lot of the information, you'll see the estimates of removals. And so they're assuming that the fish that die because they're released is 9% of all the fish that are handled. And so let's talk a little bit about where the board is headed on this topic and some of the solutions that might exist. Mike, I'm going to start with you because I know ASA was such an important part of passing the Descend Act, a key reduction of release mortality in important reef fisheries in the South Atlantic and the Gulf. So, ASA has been a leader in release responsibility. So has CCA. ReleaseSense.org is an important website we put together with key partners. So talk about it from, the tackle perspective and that balancing act of access versus not wasting this important resource.
Yeah, thanks for bringing this up. It's something that we've done a lot of work on. We've worked. Did I miss some of that? Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. I was seeing you talking, but wasn't hearing you talking. So maybe there's a little bit of a lag. Anyways, yeah. So we tried to come at this from an action standpoint. Like you guys have Release Sense. We worked with On the Water Media Company, developed some education and outreach materials for best handling practices. And then also the use of circle hooks because that regulation was new for a lot of states throughout the management unit. I really do think that the best way for us to tackle this release mortality issue is to educate and inform our anglers on best handling practices and the use of the right gear, not handling fish too long, like basically the whole program that we all think about as anglers and just making sure that everybody knows that and everybody knows what the techniques are to help the survivability of released fish. And there's also responsibility there. And so we know that in specific areas like the Chesapeake Bay, when the water is really hot, we know that those fish are going to be strained and that water temperature puts an extra strain on them. And so just really being aware that that's an issue and trying to adjust your fishing practices to address that. I would much rather see educated anglers with better handling practices, increasing the survivability rather than regulations come in and say you can't target striped bass because this is a really poor condition for their survivability. Do I think that there's possibility for there to be a combination there? Yeah, perhaps. But in my opinion, what we can do as an industry is help educate and inform on this topic. And hopefully that will bring upon the change. I mean, the challenge here is we don't have a great mechanism for measuring the impacts that will have. Whether it's with closures for a week at a time or whether it's with informing anglers that using better handling practices to increase survivability. So we don't really have a great mechanism for measuring the success of that. And I think that if we educate anglers, that would be a great way for us to get at this. And that's what we focused on.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no real way to quantify the exact fish savings. And that's part of the criticism we provided of what Maryland's doing. And not to harp on that, but that 2-week period of the closure in the summer is partly to make up for the whole reduction that Maryland was required to have in mortality, but also because we know that hot air, hot water, low oxygen is going to lead to a higher likelihood that the fish dies, upwards of 20-30% likelihood. And then in the spring, in the cold weather periods, there's some important studies on the Susquehanna Flats when I know Marty was still back at Maryland DNR, where anglers were involved with the scientists and holding fish in pens and observing them and realizing that these fish can handle some handling, responsible handling in the cold weather periods, and shallow hooked fish are not as likely to die. But again, from a management perspective, you have to use this broad kind of tool from a coast-wide year-long approach. And that brings us to the 9% assumption that, again, is really hard to move the needle on. And I will say it's important. to mention that a couple of years ago, that assumption was 8%. So now the managers had decided to move it up 1% and just to be a little more precautionary and be counting more dead fish that could die, but maybe don't. So Marty, Potomac River Fisheries Commission, your team of commissioners that you answer to, crafted some different regulations for the summertime. And I can't remember them off the top of my head, but tell us what your approach was to avoid some of these rec angler discard issues in the summer in the Potomac, because I know that water's warm too. So what are your regs this year or last year?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So we achieved our mandatory reductions strictly through a closure. So we wanted to, and we worked with DNR and VMRC technical staff to help us out because we don't have an MRIP estimate. So we had to be reliant somewhat on the intercepts that happen on both sides of the river. So it was a real collaborative exercise to try to go ahead and use that data. It was imperfect, as it always is. But we had broad consensus to try to achieve our entirety of our reduction through a closure. Part of that was from some observations that came up in our advisory committee meetings. We have a lot of the problems you see elsewhere in the Chesapeake with hypoxic zones during the summertime, and these animals become condensed in discrete areas and often high in the water column, making them easy to find, easy to catch, and they're also stressed out that time of the year, right? So they're vulnerable, unlike they are in cold weather times of the year. So I was very proud of the discussions that our advisory committee and our community, when we have our advisory committee meetings, they're typically really well attended. I don't know, I've just found it to be unique. Folks struggle in other areas. I don't know how it is these days up in Annapolis, but we get folks to turn out. We have really good, vigorous discussions. And where we eventually settled out is, okay, let's go ahead and afford some protection during this really stressful, physiologically stressful time of the year. And they also coveted the opportunity to fish in the latter part of the year. They expressed another desire to fish all the way up to the end of the calendar year. And down in the Potomac, for those of you that do that, sometimes we have them in the river, sometimes we don't. But when we do, there's a lot of folks that want to fish down there. So they didn't want days off later. So I guess where I'm going with this is we had a few focal points to work on. We did the analysis and we wound up putting more or less a bell curve of or put our closure of days from, I think it was July 5th to August 19th. And what that does is it draws a bell curve over the warmest water temperatures and the highest hypoxic volumes we have in the river. And we work with the DNR folks to get that hypoxia volume information. And so there were really well-informed discussions, and everybody left feeling that we did the right thing. Could we have used some of those other tools, Mike has talked about and others, and you have possibly, but we thought this was the simplest thing. It was the best thing for the species. And it gave some of those anglers that late season opportunity in the cold weather where we know we have lower mortality rates. So I really had very little folks that gave us some blowback on going that direction. It was top to bottom, from the advisory committees all the way up to the commission members. It was almost universally adopted. And it may not be always that easy in other jurisdictions, and I'm sure it's not, but that was our story on how we accomplished that 1 year reduction. Again, it worked for us, and maybe it doesn't work in other areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I've said earlier, this fishery is very diverse. The way people participate in it is very diverse. And I know a large part of some of the ocean and the Northeast fisheries, some of their biggest challenges with discard mortality are from deep hooking. And so, guys fishing eels or bait and that kind of thing. So I think the circle hook implementation, which will be is on the agenda to be finalized with the commission, is important, and that's a key way to solve some of the challenges with discard mortality. But really, I think that educational piece is key. And it's amazing. Sitting here in Maryland, I've always thought, well, I know that we need better data. Of course, data costs money and people and resources that just don't seem to be available right now. Because in a perfect world, I'd love to see a system where a portion of the Chesapeake's closed because certain conditions exist that allows access elsewhere. It allows you to target other species. Because last night at the public meeting that went on quite a bit about summer closures, lots of great comments and lots of great anecdotal information from the water, but it's always got to come back to managers being able to actually justify actions behind science and get cooperation with our anglers. So, I'm an eternal optimist. I always urge people to think of it through a positive lens and try and find ways that a decade from now, this issue will be put to bed, because I think that's the ultimate goal here. I think the fishing community has been responsible to the resource for a very long time. I mentioned the excise taxes, the things that we have always supported and driven to support public management. Think about things on the federal level, like the Modern Fish Act, that is, shaping the future of fisheries management for recreational angling. Commercial fisheries were the beginning of, or fisheries management was designed around managing a commercial fishery, not around recreational fisheries. And if you need to kind of wrap your head around that, think about it. Think about if you're busy, you like, I'm in a busy period of life. I got a 2-year-old upstairs. Mike just had a young baby. Congratulations. And, we're busy. Now, he probably is going to fish a little more because he lives right on the water. But, you're throughout your life, you're going to fish at different times and at different amounts. My 20s, I fish like crazy. In my late 30s, I don't fish at all. I talk about it every day. How the heck can management ever be expected to understand that personal trend that I make and all the millions of anglers, all that overlap? It's almost impossible to really understand what's going on. But I mentioned the Modern Fish Act, and if you go to the Sport Fishing Policy, Center for Sport Fishing Policy, sportfishingpolicy.org, there's actually a kind of a progress report on some things that are being done to advance and modernize fisheries management on a federal level. And I know that all the managers around the table come into this with a passion for our fisheries, tremendous technical knowledge, tremendous on-water experience, and perspective. So again, I'm optimistic and extremely honored. I'll be sitting at the table with you, Marty, and working with Mike moving forward on this striped bass topic. I'll leave both you guys with any last comments, because I know we're going long here, and this won't be the last time we get a chance to talk about striped bass together. So, Mike, you go ahead first. What's some take homes and your advice to anglers out there that are watching things on social media and probably a little frustrated and concerned about the status of striped bass?
Yeah, I guess I would just say get involved in the process. And I think it's going to be really important for all of us to come to the table with thoughtful ideas and a willingness to work together to achieve what we need to achieve and rebuild this stock. It's not going to be easy if you come to the table and you want everything that's on your list. And I think there's going to be some give and take for sure here, and we're going to have to work together to get it done. And it's been done before. I mean, this stock, I'm not saying that it's at the level that it was when the moratorium occurred and everything that went into rebuilding it the first time. But there's a clear trend here and a decline in the resource that we need to address. And we want to bring great fishing back to the striped bass fishery. And that's really important for everybody, regardless of what side you're on. And it's really important for ASA and our membership and our manufacturers and wholesalers and retailers. And I'm just excited to work together with everybody to get this done. And hopefully people seeing this will feel encouraged to get involved and help us find solutions for this important fishery. So Dave, really appreciate the time. Thanks for having me. Absolutely.
And it's everybody has the opportunity to get involved, period, the end. And if you don't have the time, ASA, CCA, there's plenty of groups representing different interests out there. You may not agree with what we're up to. So there's other folks that can represent you. Really focus on that and know that also, Marty, for your final thought, longstanding managers with tons of important knowledge that is being applied right now. So Marty, tell us, give us some final thoughts and a final message for our audience.
Thanks, Dave and Mike. So I guess my final thoughts for everyone as we get ready to start this process, right, is we're blessed with a lot of folks that are really knowledgeable from an experiential and intellectual level. The fishermen that are on this call, I'm looking at the list of comments, the people that are there, I know a lot of them. These people have a lot of experience. They have a lot of knowledge. And if they don't know it, they should know it when I tell you we care about what you have to share with us. And the folks that are participatory on the advisory committees and the delegations like you, Dave, there's another layer that feeds into this. and the folks in the industry in the different sectors like Mike represents. And then into the ASMFC process, which gets bashed a lot. But I can tell you unequivocally, looking around that table from the staff, which are incredibly talented, and the folks that sit at the board, I can sit there with a straight face and look at every single person. There's probably close to 50 people around that board. The amount of knowledge that's amassed there, we have the wherewithal, is what I'm trying to say, to do the right thing, to make the right decisions. It takes all of us working together. It may sound really, really cliche, but we need people to engage, be informed, and work in concert with each other. So I'm really, really hoping we don't get many opportunities like this. Last one was in 2003. So this is a really big deal. And I'm taking it dead seriously. This may be one of the most important exercises I ever get the privilege to be participatory in. And that's the way I'm viewing it. I'm in the fourth quarter, guys. I turned 60 a year ago. I hope I got a little gas in the tank, but this is going to be probably one of the most important things I've been involved in my entire career. That's the way I'm treating it. But it takes everybody working together. So kumbaya, and let's nail this thing coming down over the next year or whatever it takes. Let's do it right.
Yeah, as long as it doesn't matter how long it takes, it's got to be done right. You're absolutely right. And I love the people that bash the process, because I really feel like they should just be looking in the mirror. The ASMFC truly is us, literally. I mean, yes, now for two of us for sure, sitting around that table, but it's all of us. And it's the people that are willing to put the effort into the process. Put down your phone. Stop looking on Facebook. Stop looking at Instagram and pictures. Look at the document. Take it, print it out, take notes, engage in these tough conversations with your fellow anglers, and become informed. Nobody has all the answers, and collectively we can work together to try and solve the problems. I'm very fortunate to work on behalf of the members of CCA every single day to push better ideas and to try and hold managers accountable. And I take it very seriously that as I sit at the table next week at ASMFC, I know I'm representing Maryland, not just CCA. I'm representing the resource. And so I know that the folks around the table are just like that for their collective states. And, I look forward to doing that work with all of you. And I want to remind people that our podcast, this is the brand new format, of course, with the live stream. You get to see our beautiful faces. Every Thursday, the last Thursday of each month, the What's on the Line podcast is back. And we're not always going to talk about fisheries management. We want to let you know these important topics and give you the resources to find things you need. Again, the ASMFC website is where you can find everything. No matter what state you live in on the Atlantic coast, you have representation on various boards there. So get involved and learn about it and come to the table, or come to the microphone in some cases, educated and ready to give respectful dialogue. But back to the podcast, if you want to provide any input on what we've heard tonight, or if you're viewing this years in advance, it'll be on YouTube, it'll be on our Facebook page, and uploaded to our podcast platform as you can get through Apple Podcasts and Spotify or SoundCloud. So I think next month we're going to be talking about panfish and some little bit on management, but mostly targeting those tasty little critters that exist, of course, in tidal waters in the Chesapeake, but also probably your local reservoir or lake. I think the panfish are a fish that should connect all anglers because they're willing to bite and they're great in a pan. So we'll talk about that next month, and then we're going to be talking about habitat and some of the great work that folks like McGuire Marine are helping us execute in March. And we'll add more episodes if you like what you see. Let me see real quick. I got away from the comments. I can't follow all that right now while we're live. So thank you, everybody. Again, thank you to Marty. Thank you, Mike, ASA, Potomac River Fisheries, and so much more than that. You two we're great to have. It's great to have you involved in the process, and thank you very much. We will say good night, everybody.
Thanks, Mike. It's been a pleasure to be with both of you.
Likewise. Thanks, guys.